Hello, everyone. Welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series. For parents, I'm your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, a 501c3 nonprofit based in Denver, Colorado, with a mission to educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high THC marijuana products, particularly on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. Thanks for joining us today. I have another wonderful guest whom I will introduce in just a moment. After I go over a couple quick logistics, we are recording this session. Please share it with your friends and family after today. We have a handout for you that Dana has kindly provided of her slides. It is little thumbnails and some lines for you to take notes, and that is in the handout section of your control panel. And for those of you watching the recording, it's on this same page. You can find the link to it. Dana will be presenting for 45 minutes about, at which time she will take your questions. So please be ready to ask your questions, and you do that by typing them into the questions box in the control panel. As you think of them, please type them because I will read them off to her in the order they were received at the end of her presentation. So with that, I'd love to introduce Dana Stevens. She has been with us here before at Johnny's Ambassadors and has kindly agreed to come back for another important topic on lobbying and advocacy, what nonprofits can do and probably can't do. So we'll hear about that from her. She has been with Community Action Service and Advocacy since 2007 and currently serves as its executive director. Dana has also been a part of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, or SAM, since it launched in 2013 and currently leads SAM efforts to support local control measures to prevent marijuana normalization and commercialization. She holds a bachelor's degree from UCSD in Urban Studies, a certificate in nonprofit management from the University of San Diego, and a master's in public administration from SDSU. Dana, thank you so much for being here again and for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you, Laura, for having me, and thank you to Johnny's Ambassadors for all the good work that you are doing in the community. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to folks about what you can do as a coalition or a nonprofit organization, and how to avoid any challenges regarding your advocacy work. I am going to just remove seeing myself because that's distracting, and let's get going. When we met before, we talked about all the wonderful policy work that you can do in your community to push back on the marijuana industry, to influence local policies around where and how marijuana businesses can, and if marijuana businesses can operate in your community. And one of the questions we always get from that discussion is, I'd love to, but we can't do that sort of thing. We're a nonprofit. So it feels like a greater conversation needs to occur around what nonprofits can and cannot do. The biggest question that we get, or most frequent question that we get around nonprofits and policy work, is, can a nonprofit organization lobby? And the answer to that question is yes. Of course, nonprofits can lobby. A 501c3 status does not prohibit lobbying. It just means that we have to abide by a certain set of rules and regulations. Part of those rules and regulations are really about how much money can be spent to do that sort of activity and the parameters around that activity. We don't want to spend more than we have to. We want to know the things that we can do that don't count as lobbying, but instead counts as advocacy, or a little lowercase l for lobbying, and which things we have to report. So we're going to talk about those things today, and hopefully when you're done with today's webinar, you're going to feel confident about how you can communicate with decision makers, policymakers, and be an influencer in your community. So let's start with the common understanding about lobbying. Um, and I like to go back to good old-fashioned Webster's, and they define lobbying as a person acting for a special interest group who tries to influence the introduction of or voting on legislation or the decisions of government administrators. So each of those words is selected for a reason, and we're going to talk about each of them because we have to follow the rules. So when I think about special interests, we often go to special interests are the gun lobby, the pharmaceutical lobby, education has lobbyists. All of our cities have lobbyists. Our county has more than one lobbyist. So if we think about who are the special interests that we represent, remember that was part of the definition. Who do we represent in our policy work? Well, we represent people who care about public health. We represent people who care about mental health, who care about kids, who care about substance abuse, prevention, and treatment. We care about people that want to ensure that they are creating safe and healthy neighborhoods to raise their families, or seniors care about safe and healthy neighborhoods to where they feel safe retiring and growing old. So we do represent a special interest, but our special interests are not what is typically considered a lobby. They're very broad and they're general because a lot of people fit into this that don't even know they do and haven't asked for our help. But they often can't speak for themselves in these matters. So when we think about advocacy, what is advocacy? It's really about support for a recommendation or that process for supporting a cause or a particular policy recommendation and or a proposal. So we're really talking about speaking out, not just among ourselves, but more broadly to a broader audience. And that's important if we want to influence decision makers, right? So advocacy includes a range of persuasive communications. Why persuasive? Because we want people to support the cause. So we want to persuade them to our side or to our understanding. Even when we're not taking sides on a policy, we're still trying to persuade them to understand the danger of marijuana use, the danger of normalization, the harm that can be done to children, any children. There are no 100% protected children. Don't we wish there was a vaccine to protect kids from abuse, substance abuse, but there isn't. That's our job as parents and as caring community members. So think about the communications that we do when we're doing a public forum, talking about educating parents. Laura talked about Johnny's Ambassadors, educates parents. That is persuading. That would fall under the activities that are generally considered just education, not lobbying. So thinking about the differences, important, back to that early definition, it's only considered lobbying if it's to a legislative body. Your communications are to a legislative body or its members. And it's only considered lobbying if it's the legislative process. So think about that. After marijuana has become legalized in your community and you're no longer talking about that people should vote no on this statewide ballot measure, and we're just talking about the harm it can do in a community, we're no longer talking about a legislative process, right? It is already passed. It's already a law. Once the policy is enacted, it's no longer lobbying, and it's not considered lobbying when we're just trying to influence that regulatory or administrative process. That's an important thing to understand, because that's a lot of what we're doing in our community work when we're talking about, we don't want these kinds of businesses right by our schools or our parks or places where youth congregate. Now we're talking about that regulatory or the administrative process or the implementation process of an existing law, not lobbying. So I'm going to give some examples that I want you to think about. So let's start with thinking about, what is a legislative body? Who are those members? And what's a legislative process? So when you think about the president, if you write a letter to the president, is that lobbying or advocacy? If you communicate with your governor, is that lobbying or advocacy? What about your town mayor or your city mayor? What about school boards? We often think about school boards as a legislative body, but guess what? They're not. None of these listed are legislative bodies. Even a school board. School boards, even though the people who serve on them, the board of trustees, are often elected, they are actually implementing the state education code. Their job is to interpret and administer and implement the state education code. So they don't write state education code at the school board level. Their policies are about implementing, how to go about implementing. So that one's a tricky one that people often misunderstand as a legislative body, but they're not. That's why they're often called the board of trustees. Think about zoning boards. Oftentimes, zoning boards in a community are appointed by the council members. They are not a legislative body. Even if they are voted on, they're still not a legislative body, because they are interpreting the zoning codes of a city. The zoning code is created by the city council and by the city administrators, not by the zoning board. Those are, or sometimes they're called planning commission. They are implementers. They only make recommendation for a city council. A decision made at a planning board or a zoning board is typically appealed to a council, and a lot of times it has to be that as a recommendation to that board. I live and work in San Diego County, and we get kind of frustrated, a lot of us in prevention in our community, because we advocate at that zoning board, and they might make a recommendation that we agree with, and then it goes on to the council, and the council votes against their own appointed planning commission. So these kinds of groups can be a little tricky to understand, but a lot of the local control policies that we've talked about in the past are going through the zoning, the zoning board or the planning commission before they go on to a council. So that would not be considered a legislative body. So already look at all the folks that you can talk to and you can talk about policy with, and you can even say, we don't like this policy, here's why we would oppose it. Here's why I personally would vote no on this, or I would vote yes on this. This is why I like it or oppose it, and why I'm going to advocate that others do the same. You can speak to all these levels of government and not worry about lobbying. None of these are considered a legislative body. So in the IRS code, they define two types of lobbying. Now that we know what lobbying is and some of the groups that we can advocate that it's not considered lobbying. So I always think about that as the lowercase l rather than a capital L, right? Or uppercase L. We can, there are two different types of lobbying. One is called direct lobbying and one is called grassroots lobbying. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what those mean and how to go about doing those. Direct lobbying is defined as communication with employees of a legislative body. So going back to that list, any of them we can communicate with. We can communicate with their staff. None of that would be considered lobbying, correct? But now let's go to those legislative bodies. It's considered lobbying only if that communication is to influence specific legislation. And what do we mean by that? That means that your communication must refer to a specific piece of legislation. So if you just talk generally to them about concerns as a parent, concerns even as Johnny's ambassadors or as CASA about the influence that legalization has had, marijuana legalization and commercialization has had in our community about young people and their opinions around risk or their perceptions of harm. And if we talk in those general terms about the harmfulness of advertising, or we want to educate them about the difference between the plant marijuana, the leafy green plant, and the all of the extracts, all the concentrates, the wax, butter, oil, shatter, whatever you want to call them. When we're talking about the differences in these kinds of products, or we're talking about the generalized harm in a community, we're not talking about a specific piece of legislation. As long as we're not saying, so on Assembly Bill number whatever, or on House Resolution 123, then we're not lobbying. Can you see that distinction? And now it's not or it's and. It has to have both of these components to be considered lobbying. It must state a specific view on that legislation. So again, it has to reference the legislation and it has to say what your view is. We think this is the worst policy that could ever happen in our community. It will have a devastating effect. And that's why we oppose this. Now you've said a view. It's not saying a view when you say we think it will have a terrible impact in our community and on the health of our young people. That's not the kind of view we're talking about. When we say, and that's why we oppose this legislation, that's the type of view, the specific view that we're talking about. Either, and that's why we oppose, or that's why we support. When we say specific view, that's what it's talking about. So those are the two elements that must be included for it to be considered lobbying. So even if you're at, with a group of people and someone else in the group mentions the legislation, but your comments simply speak about the harm that something would have in a community, reducing the regulations would have a terrible impact in our community. You've not mentioned that you oppose it. You've not mentioned the legislation. You don't have to. They know that's why you're there. And other people can speak to that if they want to. But if you're concerned because you work at a nonprofit or that your identity is associated with a nonprofit, you don't have to be concerned as long as you don't use those two elements. So think about your communication and who you're speaking to, and think about how those messages are received as you're crafting your comments or your part of a group presentation to a legislator or a legislator's staff. And never underestimate the importance of staff. They are often very influential on the legislator's position. So don't negate an opportunity to have a conversation with staff. Let's talk for a minute about grassroots lobbying. It's different in really only one way. It too is trying to influence legislation, and but its audience is the general public, not the legislator or their staff, but the general public. That's what grassroots lobbying is, really broad communication to anyone who will pick up your flyer at an event, or to anyone who will stop by your table at a health fair or a community event, or anyone who attends your community forum. That's what we're talking about with the general public. And again, that communication needs to reference a specific piece of legislation, and it needs to take a position or have a view on that legislation. But in grassroots lobbying, it must also have a call to action. What do we mean by a call to action? It's asking that general public to do something, and what that something is very specific. It's calling on the general public, because remember, in grassroots lobbying, we're talking about the general public. So the call to action has to be asking the general public or the recipient of your materials, if it's a handout, to contact a legislator or that legislator's staff, or the employee. It's very specific. Call your senator today and give a phone number, right? If it just says, make your opinion known, that doesn't name, that doesn't say what you want them to do in terms of contacting a legislator specifically, and it doesn't give that legislator's contact information. The other example can be things like a tear off, or a postcard campaign. Those would also be a call to a way to make your call to action known, is like a petition, right? But key elements here are that it needs to identify the legislation, the legislator, and provide the information on how to contact that legislator, and it needs to identify support or oppose on the legislation. If it says call your legislator and ask them to protect the health of children, now you're not saying that you support or oppose specific legislation. So these are very easy to craft kinds of statements that keep you out of the arena of lobbying. So let's talk for a minute about what is not lobbying, and things that we can do as coalition members, as nonprofit agencies. We can provide a nonpartisan analysis, maybe a public health perspective. We can share studies. We can pass along research to our legislators. And we can even say in that communication, as you're making the difficult decisions regarding implementing the recently passed marijuana legalization, a ballot measure in our state, I hope you will consider some of the research that has already been developed in other states. I'm sharing with you today research from the CDC or research from whoever, and describe it and attach it. Now you're not saying vote yes or no. you're not influencing their opinion, and you're not suggesting that they take action, whether that communication is with a legislator or with the community. That's real safe types of communication to have, is to keep pushing out all that great information that we get, right? um, Discussion about the broad social problems associated with marijuana and marijuana availability in a community, or marijuana normalization in a community, or marijuana advertising in a community, or the easy access of marijuana in a community. All of those ways, all of those types of communication are broad social problems that you can discuss without naming legislation and asking them to vote one way or another. And so all of that is safe types of communication with both the general public and with your legislator. Now, the other thing that's not considered lobbying is responding to a request. So if you receive an email from a legislator that knows about your organization or who you've worked with in the past, and they contact you or their staff contacts you because the legislator serves on a specific committee. This legislator serves on the health committee. And they're going to be having to make some votes on upcoming legislation, and they ask you to please provide them information. Now you're responding to a request. So that is not considered lobbying. And I would respond with, thank you for asking for this information from our organization. We are pleased to provide with you this analysis, this study, this research, these contacts, these local advocates. But I would make sure in my communication to say, thank you for reaching out and asking for this information. I'm happy to respond to your request. That way you have the documentation that you're responding to a request from your legislator. Now, the other thing that is not considered lobbying is when you communicate with your own member, your own representative, whether this is in your city council district, whether this is in your state assembly, your state senate, or your congressional representative. When you speak to your own representative, that is not considered lobbying. And I want to take just a moment here and remind people that your voice as a constituent is far more powerful than the name of an agency. Why? Because an agency doesn't vote. An individual votes. Your vote helps to either provide a job for them in the next session, or their ticket to wait in line at the unemployment office. So they want your vote. It doesn't hurt to say that I am a member of Johnny's Ambassadors, an organization that cares about the harm that marijuana causes to young people, and we educate people about those harms. But what they care about is your vote. That's why when you communicate with your representative, it's important to say, I'm reaching out today as a constituent in the district, or as one of your constituents, as a voter in the district. That is going to garner more attention from the representative. So let's talk about a couple more examples, and I just want to do a time check here. All right. So here's a couple of examples that people have asked me about in the past. If you are providing a legislator with education materials about, even if it's about specific legislation, and you say, dear Congressman, Jones, our organization is deeply concerned about this particular legislation, I would like to share with you how we think it will impact people in your district, or it will impact young people throughout the state, or however you want to frame that. And you describe the negative impact, or the positive impact that legislation would have on the constituency that they represent. And you conclude that letter by saying, thank you for receiving this information. We're always here to answer questions about how this issue impacts the community. Respectfully, Joe Blow. That does not call for specific action. So you can communicate that way by providing information about how it's going to impact the community, educating them about the important distinction between leafy marijuana that has, yes, a very high THC concentration of perhaps 30% versus the concentrates that are 80 to 99% THC concentration. That is not lobbying, correct? I can't see the comments, but I'm hoping that people can understand the difference in how you can communicate without stepping over the line on lobbying. Same thing goes for the media. When you talk to the media about this is why we're concerned about this specific bill in our state and the impact it could have, and describe that. Thank you very much for helping us get this information out to the public. You're not asking people to vote one way or another. So this is not lobbying. And I want people to be very confident when you engage in these activities, as long as you're not calling for specific action on legislation. You're still okay. So what about when we talk to these regulatory agencies, when we talk to the Department of Public Health? What about when we're talking to the FDA? There's a lot of communication with the FDA right now around vaping and that sort of thing. Is that considered lobbying? Even if we say, how we feel about them, what if we mention certain legislation? Is that considered lobbying? What about conducting a public education campaign where you send out mailers to people, talking to them in the general public, and you give your opinion? Johnny's Ambassadors is very concerned about this legislation coming before our state Senate. We want you to understand the importance of this legislation and the impact it will have in our community. Is that lobbying? And the answer is no. Why? Because a public education campaign is not lobbying, even when it's communication directed at the general public, because you haven't asked them to contact their legislator today and ask them to vote no. That moves you into the onto the side of the equation that is lobbying. And because the regulatory agency is just that, they're not rule making, they don't pass policy, they are implementers. So understand the difference between regulation and policy making. When you're talking to regulatory agencies, it's not lobbying. So, having said all that, if your nonprofit or your coalition still wants to lobby, that's okay. You're allowed to do that. I want to take just a couple minutes. I want to take just a couple minutes to tell you how to do that in a safe way within the IRS regulations. First of all, you need to know that if you engage in lobbying activities, like you're allowed to do, you're going to need to fill out a separate tax form, and it's called the 501H. It's just a tax form that your tax preparer or your auditor, your accountant can help fill out for you. You'll have to do the record keeping though, because it's all about the amount of money that you spend on those activities. And guess what, folks? It's a lot of money that you can spend. So here's how you calculate that. You can spend up to 20% of the first 500,000 of your tax exempt budget. That's a lot of money. You can spend up to 15% of the next $500,000. Then you can spend 10% if you have a budget of $1.5 million on that last $500,000, you can spend 10% of that. Plus, if you're a $2 million organization, you or more, anything over $150,000, you get to spend 5% of the remaining after that $1 million. So you can spend a lot of money. However, here's what you need to know about that money. If you have federal funds, you cannot use those federal funds to lobby. However, so the money can't come out of your federal dollars. However, the federal dollars that you have count toward that income in that calculation. It counts toward the lobbying expenditures. It's just that you can't use those federal dollars. Now, we also are state funded, and in our state, in California, you can't use your state dollars for lobbying activities either. We also receive funding from our county here in San Diego County. Our county says that we're not allowed to use their dollars for lobbying efforts. So you need to understand your various funding sources, and you can use those unrestricted funds, but in doing the calculation, all of the money counts toward the allocation. And doesn't that just make a lot of us want to do some big ticket fundraising so we can lobby with a lot more money, right? The other interesting thing I want you to understand is that none of your volunteers, so if you have an all volunteer board of directors, or you have a large cadre of volunteers at your organization, none of their time counts toward lobbying or counts toward the expenditure if they are volunteers. So your youth can speak to legislators and they can say, please, Senator so-and-so, vote no, because they are volunteers. So your time when you take them to visit the legislator counts because you're funded, if you are funded. Now, if you're funded out of all donations, you don't have to worry about that. You just have to worry about the amount of money, right? But volunteers, your volunteer board of directors, all of the volunteers who come out to support you when you're doing community-based advocacy and program work, none of their time, the cost of their time, because they're volunteers, none of that counts toward your allocation. So just remember, it was the intent of Congress when they approved of 501c3 organizations to allow the advocacy and the lobbying activities. And it's their job, it was their intent by providing detailed clarification that demonstrates that their intent to allow lobbying activities. So and then by providing specific documentation that helps you report that, it's to encourage greater participation by nonprofits in the legislative process. Whether you do that through grassroots lobbying, through direct lobbying, or through education and advocacy, without using those terms that we talked about. This clarification is intended to provide greater participation, not to tamp down on nonprofits in participating in the legislative process. And most importantly, please don't forget that your voice as an individual has such great weight with your own representatives. And don't be afraid to use that. Just because you work for a nonprofit doesn't mean you have forfeited your right to participate in the democratic process. So don't willingly give that up. Now, your director would probably prefer you send that email from your personal email if you're emailing to your legislator, or that you call from your personal cell phone, not your desk cell phone, if you intend to use those three key components. And what were they? Specific legislation, a call for action, and telling your position. So if you're going to do those things, do them as an individual from your desk. If you do not have a blessing from your director on how to do those as a nonprofit. I always like to tell people, if you don't like the laws and how they pertain to you, get out there and advocate to change them. And I thank you very, very much for participating today. I'm happy to entertain your questions. And I hope that this webinar gave you more confidence in how to be an influential nonprofit or an influential constituent in the policy and influencing policies in your community. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. And we have Dana's contact information up here on the screen for you. dstevens@casaneighborhoods.org. She has a few emails, but that's the one that is best for her. I'm going to take her slides down here so that
thank you, Laura.
So that we can talk and you can see me. Can you see me now, Dana?
I can. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. So, and I gave your information out to someone else in the chat already. So we have 19 people on right now. I would like to invite to ask you. It's free consulting, right? You're going to give us any advice. So anybody on the line, if you have questions about what Dana said and the guidelines and what you can and cannot do, then make sure to type that in the question box, and I'm going to read those off to you. So as we wait for some of those questions, I have some questions to clarify. Okay, so if an organization, a nonprofit, is contacted by another state where we do not live, and let's just make up a state, Montana. That's not the state, but let's just pretend it is. And they are trying to pass some marijuana legislation, and they want you to come on and talk to some of the interested parties there in Montana about, in my case, what happened to my son. And so if I don't actually talk about their bill, vote yes or no, what it is that I want them to do, if I'm simply educating them about something that happened to me, in that case, do I have the choice of whether to represent myself as a parent, or would I then be able to also represent myself as founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, since I'm not doing those things that you mentioned? In that case, does it matter how you represent yourself?
In that case, it wouldn't matter how you represent yourself, because you're not talking about a bill number. You're not telling them to vote one way or another. So you're in good shape. And I think just because I know your story and it's powerful, I think that the voice of a parent telling this very personal story, and how that story, how what happened to your son really was the catalyst for you becoming a broader advocate on the issue and starting this organization.
Yes.
Then bring up Johnny's Ambassadors. Why not? You want them to know that this organization is out there to help support them and give them access to more education. But when you're telling Johnny's story, your story as a mother, you are not lobbying.
Okay.
And think again about your audience. If you're talking to the advocates who are going to go out and do the advocacy in that state, you're not you're you're not influencing that legislation, right? And the
Right.
other thing, as these as we get involved, if there's not a bill number yet, if there's not an official ballot measure yet, how could you possibly be lobbying?
Because you're not mentioning anything because it's just informational at that point.
It's general. It's
Okay.
it's general about this concept of legalization. You don't know what that might look like in that state. You're not
Right.
speaking to a specific bill because that bill doesn't exist yet.
So then let's take it to in Colorado where there is a bill. Let's
Okay.
say 1317 regulating marijuana concentrates. And I went to the Capitol, John and I, and we marched right into our senator's office, and our actual representative,
Hmm.
uh, came for a meeting, and we talked as Johnny's parents about what happened. So we did not, in that case, talk about Johnny's ambassadors
Hmm.
because my understanding, and is this correct, that because there was a bill, we were talking to a legislator and we
Hmm.
didn't want to influence. So we would not have wanted to say vote yes or no in that meeting then, correct? In reference to Johnny's ambassadors, but because we came as parents, in that
Yes.
instance, then it's fine.
Yes, and you can make that really clear from the get-go by saying, Senator so and so, I'm here today as a constituent. I want to tell you about what happened to me and why I care. You can even say why I care about this particular bill and why it frightens me to think that, it's going to become more available in our community, or why I think it's important to have tighter regulations around the concentrates. Let me tell you my story as a mother and what happened to my son. I'm going to share with you about Johnny.
And if we would have mentioned Johnny's ambassadors, then that would have been lobbying.
Only if you said that other element. That's why we'd like you today, as Johnny's ambassadors, we're asking you to
To
vote
vote
yes
yes.
or
Got it.
vote no,
So
right?
I can come in and I can educate them
Mhm.
as the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, as long as they don't mention the bill number, don't have a call for action, don't request a vote. You can
Mhm.
still, because our mission is to educate.
That's
And
right.
do get a lot of requests from other states to come in and talk to our legislators about how did you pass 1317 and what's in it and what happened to you and what are you
Mhm.
doing at Johnny's Ambassadors. So I can come in either as Johnny's Ambassadors or the parent and tell my story. And oh, by the way, I'm CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, and we're providing this information to educate people
Mhm.
about the harms. So it seems
Mhm.
pretty simple then if I just keep those other elements out, there isn't going to be a question.
That's right.
Nice.
That's right.
That's very good to know. All right. How do nonprofits who are medical marijuana initiatives when they are DFC funded?
So even as a DFC, you can educate people, even legislators, about your concerns regarding the harm, the message, the implication of medical marijuana, the access by youth. You can still educate. It's all those things that we talked about. If you're DFC, if you are a DFC, our organization was a DFC also. So I want to go back to what you can and cannot do. Do not mention the legislation by bill number. Do not ask them to vote one way or another. Tell them you are there to provide education. when you go to the DFC conference and you have the legislative days and you go to the Hill, I mean, they take you by bus from the conference to the Hill. They help you set up appointments with your legislator. Talk to them about the efforts of your coalition to engage the community and educate the community. And they are a member of your community, so you want to educate them too about marijuana and why you are deeply concerned about blah blah blah. Now, if you are speaking to your state legislators and there's a state ballot measure, then the legislator is just one other vote. If it's a ballot measure, they don't have more influence on that piece of legislation because they're just an individual voting. If it's state legislation that they will take a vote on as a legislator, that's when you don't want to tell them how to vote. So please vote no. So please vote yes. You know, stay away from that and you're in good shape. Talk about why your coalition members are so concerned. I brought today coalition members so and so, she's a mother. I brought with me Laura, her son, and she's a member of our coalition. Her son it was deeply, fatally affected by marijuana. I'd love for you to hear her story, right? So even if you are the staff of the DFC, you set up the appointment, you printed the materials, you put together the packets that have your DFC logo on them, you're going to bring your coalition members to speak to the legislator. They're not paid staff. And you're going to ask them to please talk about their concerns, but not to say, please vote yes or no on bill number ABC 123, right?
Got it. That's awesome. So if you have an organization who is leading up a coalition of 20 different nonprofits in Denver who all want 1317 to pass, and they have a flyer that says, all of these organizations encourage you to vote yes on 1317, you would not want to put your nonprofit name, Johnny's Ambassadors, then on that flyer, correct? Because then
Correct.
that would be considered lobbying, and that is against the rules of what 501c3s
Right.
should do.
It's not against the rules of what they should do. It would mean that you have to account for that, the printing of it, the time it took you to design it. Yeah.
Like you're just letting them put your name on it, and you spent no money in doing that.
But it says that your coalition is part of that lobbying effort.
Okay.
I would be careful of how you use your coalition name if it's saying directly vote yes, vote no.
Okay. Yes, because
Right.
I have had other states contact me and say, we want to put Johnny's Ambassador's name, you know, on this flyer to vote no on, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I've always said, you know, I really am not comfortable doing that because it's for a specific legislative activity and a bill to vote yes or no.
Right.
I can come in and I'd be happy to talk to your your legislators or senators or representatives about Johnny's story and tell my story as a mom.
Yes, and that's how that should be. They can list your name, Laura Stack. They can even put, for instance, parenthetically, CEO Johnny's Ambassadors. And then I would use a little asterisk, and at the bottom, and you see this a lot on campaign materials, even for candidates, they'll asterisk somebody's and it'll say for organizational name for identification purposes only.
Got it.
Because that
not meant to imply, you know, endorsement of or whatever.
Yes, not to imply organizational endorsement of the candidate or of the bill, right?
Okay.
But Laura Stack can, because as an individual, you get to do whatever you want to participate in participatory democracy.
Yes.
Right? As long as it doesn't violate laws. But as an individual, lending your personal name, that's your name. That's your name.
Got it. Yeah.
And CEOs, I mean, I know you Johnny's Ambassadors, you started for your son. There probably won't ever be another CEO unless you someday want to retire and have somebody else carry on the organization.
Right after I
But
die, maybe.
yeah, there you go. But agencies carry on. It, it it's not the individual. Now, a lot of times our passion projects have the identity of the individual that started it because they started it
Right.
in honor of their child or
Yeah.
someone that they love, but it's you as an individual. You don't forfeit your right to participate in democracy.
Yeah. And if I'm just
And
giving
Johnny's
a
ambassador can, yeah, Johnny's ambassadors can lobby. You just have
yes.
to keep track of your money. You have to know that it's not government money or what the regulations for that government money are around lobbying, and you're going to have to file a tax form. So those are the parameters. You can do it. You have to file a form, track the money, and know that the money was available for lobbying use.
And
So
in our
personal
case,
donations.
we're all privately funded. So luckily, unlike the coalition who just asked the question, we don't have to worry about DFC or we don't have grants, we don't have anything. We're all
Right,
just privately funded and we
right.
haven't spent any money on lobbying. But I do get asked a lot, hey, can you come on and give a 1-hour educational webinar, on marijuana and the harms? And so I talk about that all the time, even though there are lobbyists present, we are talking about a certain bill. And so
Right,
that in that case, that's not even under the lobbying umbrella at all.
right.
Got
But
it.
think of the gift you could be for these DFCs if you ever decided you wanted to use some of that private donation to have an influence on legislation by actually lobbying for that. And using your personal name and your organization to help influence that because you can and some of the
Mhm.
others can't. That's
Right.
so we have to think about what is the best role for our organization. And I just want the DFCs who are here today know that this is why we build membership, community members, even, and it's okay that they might be the CEO of a bank and that and that their title says that they're the CEO of the bank, but they're there today speaking as a community member who's concerned about drugs in the community or the easy access to marijuana or the influence of normalization in the community. They can do that as a coalition member, and their salary as a CEO of a bank isn't counted toward that lobbying. Does that
And
make
they're a
sense?
volunteer. Yeah.
And
And
because they're a volunteer.
okay. And so what about 501c4s that are asking us, you have a 501c4 who is in the same space, an allied partner, and they say, write your senator now, call to action. And you, as the coalition or the nonprofit,
Hmm.
want to share this information with your members. Can
Hmm.
you share something from a 501c4 that has a call to action in it, say on your social media? Can you copy paste a letter from a 501c4 and simply say, voice your opinion on this issue to your senator and put in their information, or is that not allowed either?
Well, because then you use the call to action. What you might do with that is say, one of our coalition members asked me to pass this along. I'm
Okay.
passing this along on behalf of a coalition member.
And if they are, just an organization that has similar interests, you can pass it along
Hmm.
as long as you're not agreeing with or participating in that call to action. Contact,
Correct.
even if you're just saying
Correct.
give your opinion, you're not saying vote yes or no, because you're saying let them know
Yeah.
your thoughts, that could be considered lobbying.
Yeah, that depends on who your enemies are and how much they want to argue with you or call you out. And I'm not an attorney, so I want to be
Oh
real
yeah,
clear that we're talking about hypotheticals and
absolutely.
using good judgment. I guess I would probably say as an executive director of a nonprofit, I probably wouldn't say, I might just pass it along and say, we're sharing a member's information, passing
Okay,
along information from so and so,
this
right?
is great.
We don't have to restate it if you're saying, passing it along, right?
Okay, so informational, educational, passing it along. There's a lot
Mhm.
of great words we've learned from you in this session so that we can make sure that we
Yeah,
fall
all the
within
safe words.
the
Yes,
parameters. Yes, I was
yes.
thinking about when I was giving testimony before the Senate Finance Committee about 1317 and coming and talking about Johnny's story. So everything wasn't lobbying, but if I would have said at the end,
Uh-huh.
please vote yes on 1317, that could have changed the whole dynamic if I had been there as
Right.
Johnny's ambassadors, which I wasn't.
Right, right.
Yeah,
And then it wouldn't have just been the time that you were testifying, it would have been the cost of well, you live in Denver, but I mean, think about if you had to fly, if you stayed in a
yeah,
hotel, all those costs are part of what you'd have to report,
got it.
right? It's
Yeah,
not
Dana,
just
this
the
this
hour
is
you
so
spent.
helpful. I know that
Good.
even just your handout is going
Mhm.
to be critical for the DFCs, for the coalitions, for the nonprofits, and a lot of people that I run into get a lot of these questions, and so I'll be able to point them to your webinar and to your handout. All the other comments are thank you, excellent presentation. Dana has been a leader in California and San Diego County for a long time. She is always willing to help, and I will echo that and thank you for your help
Oh,
and giving us your guidance. Appreciate you so much for being one of
uh,
Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you so much. I'm honored. If I could just close by saying that DFCs do have access to a strategizer. And so look among the strategizers on the DFC portal, and you should be able to find that. You're going to find a lot of the same material because that's where I was trained at DFC and
And use
PTA
those
and other
resources.
nonprofits. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you
Okay.
so much
Thank
for
you
joining
so
us.
much.
Thanks to all of you. See you next time here on Johnny's Ambassadors. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.